Hi, and welcome to another episode of Wait, Hold Up, What? As always, I'm your host, Dawn Hanks, CEO and founder of Eliminate Girl Hate. In today's episode, I want to talk about something interesting. It's that thing that, you're inside your head. We've all been there. And you're chastising yourself for not getting enough done, showing up enough, doing enough, or even just calling yourself lazy. You're not alone. In a world where women are supposed to want and do it all, it can be easy to feel less than. But what if that narrative is lying to us? What if there's a reason to be lazy? Or what if, gasp, it's not even being lazy at all? What if the reason you feel that way is because your brilliance isn't being seen for one reason or another? In this episode, we talked to Rebecca Tolbert, LICSW, lots of initials, which we'll find out what they mean, a Washington, D.C. based mental health therapist and ADHD coach whose work helps create safe spaces to explore, heal, and grow. I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation. I'm going to be honest. I can't wait to hear this conversation because I know that I need it and I hope it helps you too. So stay tuned for Rebecca Tolbert on Wait, Hold Up, What? We are sponsored by...
How many times have you heard the words workplace and culture used together and found yourself rolling your eyes at the thought? Believe me, I'm with you. I'll be honest, as I record this, I just rolled my eyes. That's because the word culture has become homogenized in such a way that they actually had us believing ping pong tables and pizza were symbolic of a good place to work. COVID changed that. Remote work was a success in the eyes of many, and as such, our ideas of what constitutes a good workplace culture have changed. And it boils down to one crucial element: equity. Now, don't you roll your eyes again on me. It's true. The expectation of employees is that they have a work environment and culture that works for them, regardless of who they are. No more cookie cutter swag and Pizza Hut deliveries, mandatory after hours, happy hours, and all of the other things they do to make us feel like we're a family. This is especially true for women. Remote work gave many more hours in the day, the flexibility to feel more productive and present, and a choice in how and what style of work is best for who they are and what they do. This is at the core of what equity means, because the old way was made for one group of people. And this is where Eliminate Girl Hate comes in. We help create safe and equitable spaces for girls and women, and we help the companies that employ them be more profitable in the process. Not rolling your eyes anymore, are you? Check us out at eliminategirlhate.com. Use code WAITHOLDUPWHAT in your contact form for a free consultation call and see how we can help you and your business. Have you ever dreamed of writing a book? I know I have. Or maybe, also like me, you've started a manuscript. Maybe you've started 10 and you've just never finished it, or never let anybody else read it, or never thought you could publish it. Wherever you are in the process, Jim Woods would like to help. Jim's a writer just like you, but he's also a coach who loves helping writers bring their books into the world and make them a reality. If you are like me, sometimes you need that push, a supportive but demanding cohort along the way to put your stories out into the world and keep you on track. Jim Woods is that cohort. Visit jimwoodswrites.com and click the Let's Chat button. Mention our podcast for a free clarity call and get your story out into the world because we need it. We are sponsored by Epiphany Recording Studio. Creativity needs to flow freely if you want to reach that aha moment that we're all looking for. At Epiphany Recording Studio, their goal is to create space that takes full advantage of those moments. From podcast and video production to music creation, you get the support you need to create compelling stories with a competitive sound. Your ideas can flow freely because they partner with you free of judgment, ready to be vulnerable, do the work, and make your projects look and sound their best. So let Epiphany Recording Studio help you reach your artistic vision by visiting them today at epiphanyrecordingstudio.com. Tell them Dawn sent you.
I have with me today Rebecca Tolbert. And in the intro, I started to go through your title and I realized I don't know what LCISW, or I don't even know if I did that in the correct order. I don't know what that means. So introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and tell us what that acronym means.
So, again, my name is Rebecca Tolbert. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker.
Got it.
There's the acronym.
There we go. I love it.
So that means I am licensed to practice social work by myself. That's what that
Gotcha.
means. So I am a mental health therapist. That's how I practice social work. And I specifically work with folks who have ADHD. And
Cool.
then so it's like two different things that I do. So that's my social worker part. And then I also do coaching for people who have ADHD.
So some social workers do not have a mental health background?
No, all social workers have a mental health background.
Okay.
They don't all do like independent therapy. Like with my degree, I could be working at a hospital. I've done a lot of stuff with like homelessness.
Oh, wow. That's
I've
pretty
worked
cool.
at middle schools. Like there's a really wide range of things you can do as an LICSW.
Yeah.
It's just the current way that I practice that right now is I have my own therapy practice.
It's kind of nice, though, because you have some flexibility in who you work with, how you work with them. And I would imagine, look, I go to therapy. Everybody who listens knows this. But sometimes therapy can be a drag as an attendee, but I can imagine it could be a drag as the therapist as well. Like you're constantly taking in all of this energy from other people. And so being able to mix that and help different types of people in different backgrounds and areas probably helps to keep the work more interesting. Sounds weird, but maybe satisfying or fulfilling as a job because you get to expand what you do more frequently, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. The bounds of what you can do as a social worker is a lot wider than as, say, like a licensed counselor or
Yeah.
like an LPC or like licensed marriage and family therapist. Like those you do individual or couple or group therapy, right? Like that's it. And social work is really cool because you've got a lot of options. And so I found in my class, I have this ADHD lens. It's kind of like how I navigate the world.
Of course.
I have severe ADHD. I was diagnosed in childhood, and I'm always kind of talking about it, looking out for it, supporting people who have it. Did a bunch of research on it in grad school too. Like all of my papers are like this ADHD research, right? Like it's just
if you're going to do the work, you might as well help yourself in the process.
Right, exactly. But it was funny because the more I would talk about my ADHD and how that showed up, and it looks very different in women than it looks in men, and social work is a very woman-centered field. A lot of my classmates came up to me and they was like, I think maybe I have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I think that was my dog's ears flapping.
I love it.
Figured it out. But I think that social work is probably like, there's probably a higher percentage of people who have ADHD who are social workers because there's all the variety, because people are in crisis and we do really well in crises.
Well, and I feel like in the cultural lexicon, when people think of social work, they think of it mainly with regards to children and like removing children from a home, right? If we're watching Law and Order and SVU and all of those kinds of shows, we have maybe this, I don't want to say negative connotation, but maybe a little bit where like they're breaking up families or they're overworked and they don't have the resources that they need. And so working as a social worker independently might not be something that people are familiar with. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely different than what you see on TV or, it's like I do clinical therapy like you would imagine a person who does clinical therapy. I had a professor and she was like, she always like facetiously referred to us as baby snatchers because that's like it. Like that's all people think of social workers. Like not the only thing we do. And that's like not even what we do. And that's like all people think of.
So obviously, ADHD is somewhat of the catalyst for why you did this work. But when you were younger, I have to back up. Sometimes I forget that you and I have talked. And so I know a little bit of the background and other people don't know. And I get all excited. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that you were diagnosed with ADHD when you were a child. How old were you?
I was in second grade.
And I know this, but for the listeners, that's a very young age to be diagnosed with ADHD, especially at that time, not giving away your age. But, in recent years, there's earlier diagnosis than there used to be. So what precipitated you getting diagnosed?
It's especially rare for women my age to have been diagnosed that young. Not super uncommon for boys, but because women...
Because of the hyperactivity?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So, and like tangents and stuff like that.
I don't know if the two of us together is a good idea.
Yeah, we can. So, yeah, what precipitated it, when I've talked to my parents about it, there was another family member of mine who was going to get testing at the same time. And as they were looking at me, they were like, okay, this kid, she's really bright, but we're not seeing that show up at school. Like, she does well on the assignments that she remembers to turn in, but and she does all the work. And then I remember my desk was just like a desk zone of papers. It was just crammed. I just remember that because it was the folding open desks, and it was up a little bit all the time, and just packed with all of these, a bunch of math worksheets, and then we're complete but not graded. That was my desk at that time. And so they were like, let's just get some testing done. Let's see what's going on here.
Sure.
And I'm like, yeah, she's definitely has severe ADHD. But for me, it is more of so there's hyperactive presentation, there's inattentive presentation, which is the daydreamer. And then there's combined, where you've got some of both. And I would say I'm more of the inattentive symptoms, but I have some of the hyperactive stuff, but mostly just daydreaming.
When you and I had talked originally, I had asked a question, and I was so shocked by the answer. The way you just described to those three versions of ADHD, I'm diagnosing myself with which one. I have been diagnosed with ADHD by a professional, but I did not get diagnosed till 46, maybe 45. But I really identify with the middle one. But I had been incorrectly diagnosed for years with a myriad of things. Yeah. And one of them many years ago, the diagnosis didn't last very long, but was bipolar. And I think when I had mentioned that to you, you had said, oh, that's actually very common. So can you explain, because I think that middle one, or even people that don't, ADHD seems so obvious, when they're hyperactive, right? But ADHD, when it is inattentive or when it is in that middle, can be confusing for people to identify right away. So can you explain a little bit about why maybe bipolar gets confused with that sometimes, especially in women?
Yeah. So one, because there's not enough training about what ADHD looks like in women. So we are more likely to just not get that diagnosis.
Okay.
That's the first issue. The second issue is that in the DSM.
Give the listeners what DSM is.
Which is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual.
Okay.
Which is when I'm giving somebody a diagnosis, this is what I look through. I have had to have large chunks of this memorized. This is the medical model of mental health. This is the Bible. So every diagnosis that you can get, every mental health diagnostic criteria is in this very large book. For ADHD, for some reason, in this American book, does not have the emotional dysregulation piece in the DSM. It is in Europe, but it's not in America I don't know. I don't know why. And so, one, women aren't getting diagnosed with ADHD as often. Two, the emotional dysregulation piece of ADHD is not part of the diagnostic criteria in our country. So people diagnosers, I guess, don't even know to look for this. And so they see these very large mood swings and fluctuations. And they're like, well, I guess it's bipolar. Because they're like, well, something's going on here.
Yeah.
And there's mood swings. And so the thing that fits for something that's going on and there's mood swings is bipolar, right? Yeah. And it's that's not the correct diagnosis. And so
a lot of that hyperactivity mirrors mania, right? In some ways. Okay.
And some of the inattentive piece could mirror
depression.
a depressive episode.
So when we talk about how the diagnosis of women doesn't happen, or girls, and that the emotional regulation isn't there, obviously in all medical everything, I don't know the official word, there's been less studies on women and girls in medical diagnosis or medical assistance and people of color. It's just, that's how it's been historically. But do you think also there's a component of it of how we think about our girls? So, there's all these idioms about like, girls should be seen and not heard, or is like my mom used to say, the second you turned 13, a switch turned and you were all over the place. Like it was, she was like, I swear to you, it was the day you turned 13. And it was just like everything changed. And so we blame it on hormones, and we call them moody, or we talk about being bossy, or all of these kind of adjectives that we use to describe girls, that just is because that's where we place girls in society. So do you think those two work together to prevent that diagnosis? Or do you really think that if we had more research, we might get past those kind of preconceptions?
I think the two definitely play into each other.
Okay.
I think that part of the reason why boys are more likely to get diagnosed is because like hyperactivity is annoying.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
For like,
fair.
Right? So like if you're in a classroom and you're trying to teach a class and there's this boy who's running around in circles, like interrupting the classroom, the teacher's like, I gotta do something about this child.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is just not, this is impacting.
It's not gonna work. It's disruptive.
It's disruptive. It's impacting everybody else's ability to learn. I can't focus on teaching because he's got like 2 pencils out of his nose and he's like doing a cartwheel and like, right? And for girls who are more likely to have that distracted presentation, she's just sitting in there in the classroom daydreaming. I was like writing comic strips about like Pencil Man and the evil eraser, and Pencil Man would go create things and the evil eraser would go and erase them. And like, that's what I did during class.
And as girls, we're also like, we know we're not supposed to be disruptive at that age. And so, there's all this research about how younger girls and the way they perform at school and how there's a shift at a certain age. So with ADHD, in the research that we know now, is there a hormonal component that shifts what ADHD presents itself as?
There is some like theory that is part of the reason why boys are more likely to present this way, girls are more likely to present that way. We also see with ADHD and women who are like, when you are in your cycle and you're like at different times during your cycle, like women with ADHD are much more likely to have PMDD, which is, like mood disorder related to your like hormonal cycle. And that is largely related to the way that your hormones impact your already neurodivergent brain.
Okay.
So with ADHD, I have a bunch of clients who will like take more meds around their cycle, like more ADHD meds. They have like a stronger dose for like this week because that's like supportive because they, their symptoms are worse. I am much more likely to like lose my keys and whatever the case may be, like that week, because that is the hormones impact your brain functioning. Like we have different brain functioning. And so how could there not be?
It's so weird. Weird's the wrong word, but talking to somebody about this, because really we don't talk about this stuff in an open way, right? In the office of a psychiatrist or a therapist or whatever, sure, free reign. But like with people every day, we don't. And when you started earlier and you talked about the daydreaming in school and some of those things, I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, things are really coming together for me. Like there's these light bulbs and synapses happening. And, I'm thinking about report cards where it was like, if she could only harness this thing that she has to be a leader with good productivity. I'm thinking about every report card I ever had. And and all of that. And then I'm thinking now about my cycle and how it presents there and how it would present at work. And I know that there are, we'll talk later about like what you can do and, you know, ways to manage it or whatever. But when you get diagnosed as a child, is the next step different than when you get diagnosed as an adult?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on like your family and what supports you have in place.
Okay.
When I got diagnosed, it was, okay, here's meds.
Ritalin?
Yeah, I did all of them at some point, right?
Because back then that was maybe the primary drug that was being used?
Yeah, they cycled me through a bunch of different ones. I don't even remember which ones I ended up using the most.
So when you are a person who struggles with major depressive disorder, and I'm going to mess up stats because I am not a clinical psychologist, but this is just my experience. So please, nobody take what I'm saying and be like, oh, this is what I heard from some podcaster. Like, talk to a doctor. But in my experience and with my therapist, and I finally found a really good one, you tend to cycle through a lot of meds until you find something that works for you. And there are different types of things that work with serotonin and work with dopamine and all of that. And there's genetics that play a piece. But a lot of times, insurance companies and medical doctors, they don't put you through genetic testing to see where you might have better results. And so instead, we're in this industrial medical complex where you're trying 400 medicines before you find one that works, or treatments. So with ADHD, is it similar that some drugs might work for you based on your genetics and others might not? Or like, how does that work and why would you cycle through so many?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I am not super familiar with genetic testing, so I'm not going to make up an answer for it. I would assume so.
Great.
But I would have to get more familiar with genetic testing. I know someone who works for a genetic testing company, and she told me that they do genetic testing for folks with ADHD. And we talked about that a little bit. But so like from her perspective, yes.
And it's still not an exact science, right? Like when I did the testing, it was like, you know, you're less likely to respond to these types of medicines and you're more likely to respond to these. So let's move over into that realm. And now let's start testing. And I still had to cycle through some to find something that worked and made sense. But it is a clearer path than putting your body through all of these meds that have all their own side effects and symptoms. And starting in the second grade to be able to cycle through all of that. That's a lot. So aside from just it being a focus or a, you know, attention issue, what was the emotional toll on you as a kid? Number one, being labeled or identified as somebody who has a disorder that might not be what everybody has, because back then it certainly wasn't. And, it, you know, most of the time when you were diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder back then, you just got called crazy. So, like, what was the emotional toll that took on you growing up, and did it change as you aged?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started taking meds in 4th grade, and I got bullied for it pretty bad. And they made fun of me and they said that I took smart pills.
Ooh.
Right? Because
crushing.
I was doing mediocre in school. And then I started taking these pills and I was getting A+ on everything, everywhere.
And did you feel better about yourself?
No.
Or did you miss the daydreaming?
I wouldn't say that I missed the daydreaming so much as so everybody's bodies metabolize substances differently. I have a body that metabolizes substances in the way that I'm like a lightweight for like anything, right? Like
same
ADHD meds. I have like one drink and I'm like, I'm good. Like, right. Like just in general, like that's the way that my body works. So my reactions to ADHD meds were very severe.
And immediate?
It was like 15 minutes and I could feel myself like Jekyll hiding, right? It was like, okay, I take it 15 minutes later, I feel like I'm a different person.
Wow.
So I felt very paranoid, and I'm a super social person. I love people. I love like interacting with people, being around people. Be like, I don't want to talk to anybody.
Wow.
Very like cut and dry, and like,
how hard is a kid to like
yeah,
regulate or like navigate is the word I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Navigate that. And
yeah. And
were you able to express that to your parents? That's how it made you feel?
not really. I took them regularly from 4th grade until 8th grade, when they were like, you're in 8th grade. You're responsible for giving yourself your own meds. So I just stopped taking them.
And didn't tell anybody?
I think it was pretty obvious. Like,
Okay. Fair.
Yeah. And it was, this catch-22 between like, I was no longer getting straight A+ on every single thing, but I was still like doing well in school, and
Because you were smart.
smart, right? And so it was fine. I went to a high school that was like really, really easy, and I didn't take meds there, and I don't take them now because of like an arrhythmia that I have. So my most concentrated time of taking medicine was like 4th grade to 7th grade. I took them
Okay.
all the time. But yeah, it had a huge impact on me. But I feel like it may have had a much smaller impact had I not had like the bullies in my class,
Of course.
who were horrible, right? Like, and
because
they actually,
feeling more focused might have felt good.
yeah,
And yet somebody is telling you that that is wrong and that you are less than, right? And so that messes with, there's a little bit of feeling good over here, but this feels way worse. So what do I do? Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Like, I have clients who love being on meds. Like,
I
this
go
is
back and forth.
amazing. It
Yeah, I go
helps me
back and
so
forth.
much. I feel great, right? Like, and or is like my anxiety is so much lower because I can focus, and so I don't feel like I'm just like
Yeah.
forgetting stuff all the time. And that's amazing. And I love that for folks. I think, to answer your first question from a while ago, is that I think that now when you get a diagnosis, meds are not the only option.
Yes.
There's a lot more research. There's a lot more support. There's a lot more strategies in place.
Yeah.
When I was diagnosed, that's it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, well, your brain is different. Here's some meds. These help.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like when they first put me on ADHD meds, it was an immediate, within one day, I did not feel different. Like the way you said, like in 15 minutes, it was like this. That was not what happened to me. But I am a person who, like you said, your desk was full of papers. Oh gosh, mirror right there, like twins separated at birth. I was always very scattered. I don't know in elementary school because I do not have memories really before the age of 12. But junior high and high school, I didn't do great at school. I was always very good at tests. And so people would be so surprised. But it was like the assignment, the homework, like it was too much. And then when I went to college, which I went arguably later in life, it took me 16 years to graduate because I was working and doing all of that stuff. I graduated with honors, but never opened up a single textbook. Like, I don't even know why I bought them because I returned them and they creaked when they opened them. Like, I just never did it. But because I had this real life experience, I was able to manipulate the situation and survive and do well. And so you find those tricks. But when I took the meds, my notes went from like this crazy mess of explosion to very linear, very clean, nice handwriting. It was so weird. And then 3 months later, it disappeared, even though I was still on the meds. And so then, and I also have an arrhythmia and all this stuff. So they were like, okay, let's go off of it. But I have an awareness now that I didn't have before. And so the awareness alone, look, I could probably still benefit from some coaching and some meds for sure. But the awareness of it, I no longer feel like something is wrong with me. And so because of that, I've sort of learned how to embrace the high and low and ride it instead of fighting it. And I don't know if that's common that you see in people or if that's your experience, but it was like, oh, if I can ride it instead of pushing against it so much, the anxiety has lowered, has not disappeared. The lows are still there, but they're not as frequent or maybe as intense. Look, I still take meds for depression and treatment for depression and things of that nature, but it has made it more manageable in my life than it probably was up until this age. So is that some of what you're talking about with coaching, like how you help people maybe understand it and not push against it so much? Or what does coaching look like for ADHD? And I'm sorry for that being such a long paragraph. Ugh.
You never have to apologize to me for rambling. I love it. I live there. That's what I tell my clients all the time. Like, no, you ramble, you go on your tangents, and we'll just like go through it together. And it's amazing. That's where all the gems are in the
Connect
journey.
the dots.
So it's great. So for coaching, that is like the heartbeat of my focus with ADHD people, because I have learned through my own life, and then research has validated this, is that if I can accept my brain, like this is the only one I've got. It's all I have to work with. And so if I can accept my brain and myself, and I can love my brain and myself, then we get to like play with it. And we get to be curious, and we get to learn and grow and figure stuff out.
I love that.
If I am spending all of my energy beating myself up for being somebody that I'm not even going to be functioning well enough to learn and grow and change.
I really hope that whoever is listening sits with that whole paragraph that you just said for a minute, because even if you do not have ADHD, that is such a thing for women to digest and hold space for. Because one of the things I have come to realize probably just in the last 6 months is I beat myself up all the time. And I used to, there's words you use to describe yourself. Someone says, tell me a little bit about yourself. And I'm like, oh, I'm super hyper. I'm all over the place. I'm creative. I'm empathetic. I cry on the dot. That's how I would describe myself all the time. And lately, my shoulders kind of go back and I'm like, no, I'm resilient. And I never realized that. And I think from everything that you've said, this idea of ADHD creates a resiliency in people because they're continually learning how to function in a new way that works with their brain. And say, it's sort of like, I was listening to a conversation about sustainability yesterday, and they were talking about how different people come to sustainability. But there are people who are lower income status or in situations where sustainability wasn't this like rich person's thing, let's save the planet. It was out of necessity. Yeah. They adapted, they became resourceful and resilient. And I think that's something people with ADHD and other mental health disorders, the world isn't built for us. And so you find new ways to make it look like you're doing all right and you know what you're doing and you're forging ahead. And I'm going to assume that's part of the neurodivergency. So if people don't know what that word means or whatever, could you explain what neurodivergency is and how it might present for different people?
Yeah. So I believe that no two people are the same, right? Everybody's different. Like we all have different brains. We all come from different life experiences, and that impacts how our brains develop and how our brains function. So I don't believe there's like this perfect neurotypical brain that like everybody has this except for people with ADHD or whatever. Yeah. But there is a more common expression of how your brain looks and how your brain functions. And that is neurotypical, right? So there's most people's brains, when you scan them, they look a certain way. They interact a certain way with stimuli when they're like in a scan. And that is like a neurotypical brain.
So it's like a response to stimuli?
Response to stimuli and like the literal makeup of the brain.
Okay.
Like what it looks like how big the hippocampus is versus how like the size of the prefrontal cortex. Like there's like this brain is typical, and then everything that's not like this is like neurodiverse.
And when like when we think about typical, just in everyday life, we think 70% or above. So like when we talk about a typical brain, is there a measurement of like why they came to think that that was typical?
I think it's just most people are like this.
Okay.
I think that's generally
Fair.
like that's neurotypical. And then neurodiverse is people who have brains that function differently than that. So like an ADHD brain will have a like smaller prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, which impacts the way that your brain works. And in an ADHD brain, there is like less available dopamine. Either our brains use it too fast or we don't make enough.
Mm-hmm.
There's two different like research studies out there about, or two different camps about that. And so then we also think of like bipolar. We've been talking about bipolar. You know, that would be like a neurodivergence, or obsessive compulsive disorder. That would be a different type of neurodivergence. Autism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would what's the other one? Oh my gosh, I just had a brain slip. The kid from Parenthood, Asperger's, would that be considered neurodivergent?
Let me tell you about Asperger's.
Yeah.
So, Asperger's is autism.
Okay.
And we don't use the title Asperger's anymore.
Oh.
So in the DSM, the most recent version, they've completely cut that out. Everything is autism spectrum disorder, because there's a very wide range of how autism manifests. Asperger was a Nazi doctor who created this diagnostic code to decide, like, literally who was going to be euthanized and who was not.
Okay.
So they're like, you know, we don't need to honor this man. Wow. And we're going to put everything in the autism category.
So interesting how the world changes. Obviously, this is all about the study of the brain. So when I was younger, I used to say, like, I have a whole myriad of health things, not just mental, but physical. Like, I'm just a grab bag of fun. And and like I have autoimmune conditions and things like that, which are also more common in women. And I remember as a kid who grew up on one side in a very churched environment, I would say I would have been a leper in biblical times. Like I would have been sent away. And then as I grew up and learned more, I would have been one of those women that was sent to the crazy bin, is what they called it then, or the loony bin or whatever, because we didn't know what we didn't know. And so anything that was unexplainable was crazy. And if you don't know this, this is fine. I didn't prep you. But when did we start being able to study the brain in a way where we could understand, oh, this is typical and this is non-typical? Like, how long has that been going on?
Oh, man. If you'd asked me this question, like,
I'm quizzing you.
And I was more like recently out of grad school, I would have a better answer for you, but I have not thought about
but
this.
Like 1900s, 1800s, like how, do you know a century?
It's more recent.
Okay, yeah, that's what I would have assumed.
My guess is that it's like more 1900s.
Okay. I'll check it out for the outro and give an exact answer.
Give an exact answer.
Okay.
I know that like I mentioned a little bit about homelessness, but I know that homelessness has greatly increased since the deinstitutionalization of our society, because we had these like very toxic supports for folks who had mental illness, like severe mental illness. And, you know, there was a lot of like, this is messed up. We can't do this. And so they're like, great, we're going to close them all.
Yep.
And then there was no supports. And so a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness are have severe mental illness, and there's no supports in place for them. Yeah. And that's like a huge part of the picture of homelessness in our country, is the lack of mental health supports for that.
I live in Portland, Oregon. And for anybody who has watched the news in the last 5 years since COVID, we have come to the forefront a lot more, just because there's been a lot of tough things that have happened in Portland. And our city, in a lot of ways, it's trying to rebuild. But, you know, we had some things where we decriminalized drug use, and yet we did not create programs, again, around those things, mental health and drugs. which a lot of times go hand in hand, because if you are not diagnosed with your mental health condition or you are not receiving help and support, sometimes you just need to escape from that, or you need something that quiets the brain, or what I'm talking from an official capacity, but those two go hand in hand. And so we've seen our homeless population grow, and we also have decriminalized being on the streets. So I had some coworkers a few years ago who visited from Copenhagen, and they were just aghast at how many tents were in our city. And we have this gorgeous, beautiful city, but there's just all of these homeless people, and they were, their meth is being done right outside the public library and in the open, because there was no, and they're pulling back some of that, and they're, looking for solutions. But I do think that stems from this idea that, oh, we now care and think you don't treat people like this, but we're also just going to leave it in your hands to figure it out, you the people, because of our medical system and our insurance system and capitalism and all of that. And families are being crushed under the weight of that, right? Because I do say this a lot as well. I understand, with my history of mental illness and the things that have occurred because of it, while it is difficult for me to manage, and it will be a continual thing until the day I die, it is so difficult for my family. And I am so aware of that. And while sometimes it hurts, the response that you get from the people that you love because they don't know how to navigate, I do have grace for that, because what an awful thing to watch somebody you love go through that. Yeah. And I don't want to use the word burden, but everybody has their own lives. And so how much are they supposed to take on? And we as a country just haven't evolved in a way to provide that kind of support. We just say, not in my neighborhood, and we push it to another neighborhood, but it's like, what is that doing to help? So as you look at that and you coach people, does some of that coaching involve their families?
That is a great question. I one day hope to do more family coaching.
Yeah.
I'm doing family coaching for one family right now, and my target clients are the kids.
Yeah, of course.
So I think there's a lot about, how ADHD shows up in relationships and like partnerships and families and all of that. And there's a lot of conversations about, how do we interact and what do those relationships look like? Mm-hmm. But I'm not doing specific coaching for like the partners or.
Okay. That's fair. Here.
Yeah. I've done a group before where I had ADHD folks and their partners come. It was like more of like a support group.
Yeah. Does some of your coaching help? Therapy, we talk a lot about reframing. And it's one thing for me to reframe how I respond. Is some of that coaching in how to better explain to loved ones how you are interpreting something, or how you're taking it in, or how it impacts you, so that they can have a role of maybe helping people to understand how to better respond to them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we talk about.
Okay. I have a few questions.
Bring it.
We talked a little bit, but like, if you could say 3 to 5 ways in which ADHD presents itself differently for women versus men, what would you say those 3 to 5 things are?
The first thing that comes to mind is the cultural expectations around women and how that impacts the way that women feel about themselves and their ADHD presentation.
Okay. And is that the same in young girls and women, or do you see it more in women?
I think it's more prevalent in women, but it's also prevalent in young girls. But it's like, you are the household manager, right? Yeah. You're the mom. You have to like make sure all the laundry's done, and you have to make sure all the, all of those logistic organizational tasks are assumed to be the responsibility of a woman.
Yeah.
In a heterosexual relationship. And that makes it really, 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 really hard for women who have ADHD, who are in these relationships. I'm very grateful to have a partner who he is like an equal partner in all of that stuff with me. So I don't feel like I carry that load of those expectations on myself, just like alone.
Do you
But I
think
think
that's
that
changing a little? Like
Mhm.
what constitutes being a man or masculinity seems to be changing a little bit. I mean, I still feel it at my age, but I'm old. So do you think that distribution of responsibilities is changing a little bit?
I think it is. I think that it's not completely changed, and it's still there's still this narrative of like, well, if I were a good mom,
Yes.
I would look like this.
Okay.
I wouldn't need him to do that. If I were a good mom,
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z. If I were a good wife, if I were a good partner, I would be really on top of all of these things. And like, I think that that is just such a, like, if I were a good woman, I'd be good at these things. Like, I have, queer clients who still have that narrative of like, oh, I should be,
Word. Is it, do you
I
think
should
it's
show
got,
up in the world like this.
do you think there's more pressure to be that way with the adoption of social media and the internet?
I think it depends. I think it depends on what corner of the internet you're in. Right? Like if you're in the like neurospicy corner of the internet, then like everybody is ADHD and everybody's autistic and everybody's allowed to be who they are and it's great and it's fun and blah, blah, blah. And if you're in the like super bomb corner of the internet where everybody's got their like, I don't even know, I'm not in that corner of the internet, but I'm assuming very organized and like all the things. Yeah, right. You probably would feel worse about yourself there than
I last year did a sweep of my social media and nobody told me to. It was just my thing that I wanted to do. And I changed everything that I looked at. And I love looking at fashion and art and things of that nature. But I was looking at all these 18-year-olds with a body that was in no way relative to mine. And so it was tiny shifts, but man, what it has done to my brain. Reducing some of the gotcha news and following things so I could learn in a digestible way about neurodivergency, about other cultures, other people's experiences. And it really did change how I felt every day, which is crazy. Okay, so cultural expectations is one. Any other ways it shows up differently for women than men?
Yeah, I would say typically, like I said before, we typically have the more distracted presentation as opposed to the hyperactive presentation. In adults, that looks like, why are you so spacey? Why aren't you paying attention? Do you even care what I have to say? Are you listening to me? Those kinds of things. That's what it looks like in women. Still some like daydreaming and stuff, but more often it's like
distracted.
Hey, are you here? You're distracted.
Yeah.
You're not tracking with me.
Okay.
Whereas in men, the hyperactive presentation, the kid who's running around in circles, like that little boy with like pencils sticking out of his nose, he's going to grow up and like never stop working.
Yeah.
So the hyperactive presentation in an adult man is like from the moment he wakes up to the moment he goes to bed, he is like doing stuff. And there's not any time when he's not doing something.
Yeah. And is the stuff that they're doing more narrow than women? Like with women, when we were talking about they're doing this and this and this, and they've got like 8 arms like an octopus, right? But men, it seems like even when they have ADHD, it's like, okay, all of my hyperactivity is going to go towards this one thing, which is work. Or, whatever it is. Is there a difference in that?
I think if it's all going towards work, it's still like, oh, I'm going to work on this one project. I'm going to get distracted. I'm going to work on this one project. I'm going to get distracted. Right? Like, I wouldn't say it's like, oh, he sits down, he starts a project when he wakes up, and he finishes it before he goes to bed, and it's the same project all day. Like, it's still like, okay, like, he's working from home, and he like does the, mows half the grass, and then he gets distracted. You know what I mean? Like, it's still lots of things.
I don't know how to ask this question other than to say, as a practicing therapist, when would you tell someone or when would you suggest someone to see someone?
Like
to go get help. Like maybe I'm out there and I'm like, I don't have ADHD, but everything these two just talked about, whoa, that just opened my eyes. Like, are there signs, excuse me, or are there traits or things where you could be like, hey, if you're experiencing this, you might just go get checked out?
So I always say this is about your functioning. And so there are folks who's like, I probably have ADHD, but I'm functioning really well. I'm at a job that works really well with me. I feel like my relationships are going really well and I'm taking care of myself and blah, 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 blah. Right. Then it's like, yeah, everything we said resonates with you, but you're fine. So keep doing what you're doing. That's great.
Love it.
I would say if you feel like your daily functioning is being impacted to the point where your friends are worried about you or your family's worried about you, or you're like, I just like don't feel great about myself, then go talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And make sure you talk to somebody who knows about ADHD in women, because you don't want to go, like you were talking about your misdiagnosis journey a little bit. Like,
yeah,
I don't want you to go through and like get put on some meds that are going to make your brain worse.
Yeah. And I would add to advocate for yourself if whatever is happening with whatever doctor it is isn't helping or doesn't feel right to you. Maybe it is right, but for you, it is not working. I think that does not happen a lot with women. They get an answer, they go, and they're like, I don't know. Advocating for yourself is so important. And there's so much research out there that shows how ignored maybe women's symptoms or their quote unquote complaints or their concern, how often those get ignored and people don't listen. And I got told that a lot. I got told, we think you're inventing this. We think you're imagining it. We can't find anything clinically wrong with you. You know, you just got to buck up and get through it. And it wasn't true, right? There were things that were happening and they were happening for so long. And had I caught them early, like there's just so much to that. Yeah. So advocating for yourself, if it doesn't feel right, go somewhere else. If the med doesn't work or it makes you feel weird, tell the doctor that and get on a different one. If you don't click with your therapist, that is okay. You might have to go to 10. I certainly went through many, many handfuls. Like find the one that works for you, because when you do, the door opens up so wide. And I love that. Sometimes it is about clicking with that person. And do you trust them enough to be vulnerable? Because if you're in this setting and you do not leave it all on the table, you're not going to get as much from the experience. Again, not a professional, but that is my personal experience advice.
As a professional, I second all of that.
Okay. Woo.
I mean, I tell people when they're doing like therapy consultation calls or whatever, I'm like, I don't care if you pick me or not.
Yes.
It's about vibes, right? Yeah. Like if you don't feel like we are the right fit, then we're not. Yep. So go work with somebody else. Like it is so important that like if you're looking for a therapist, if you're talking to a therapist and you're like, I'm not sure, I don't feel heard by them, or I don't know, like I just have like a weird vibe, like go find somebody else. There are lots of us.
100%. And don't be afraid to be specific about what you want. Like when you go buy a pair of jeans, you don't buy one that makes your butt look bad. You keep going to find the right pair. So same with a therapist or a primary care physician or whatever doctor you have. Find the one that will listen to you, but also not just tell you what you want to hear. There's a distinction there, right? Because otherwise you're not being pushed to do the work that you need to do. And like it or not, this is a lot of work. It is.
It's a lot of work. It's not fun. I mean, people are like, man, I knew I was going to talk to you today and I just like didn't want to. I'm like, I get it.
I have a friend who's a therapist, and I've been on this particular healing journey for about almost 5 years now. And I just didn't know it was going to be like this. I didn't know how hard it was going to be. I didn't know that you would lose so much. You gain a lot, but you lose a lot. People, confidants, relationships, just things, right? I start to tear up when I think about it. Excuse me, I say it to the audio files all the time. It sounds so weird when someone cries on a microphone. It's just like, so if you're weird about sound, I'm sorry. Otherwise, I'm not sorry for crying. I like to make that distinction.
Yes.
And my friend who is a therapist said, "Oh yeah, this stuff is for the birds. Like it gets way worse before it gets way better."
Yeah.
But then there are these days where like I get so proud of myself because I'm like, "Ooh, I really navigated that differently, and I navigated that in such a healthy way."
Mm.
And then sometimes I'm like, I wish that person that's no longer in my life just saw how I navigated that, because I'm like, I'm killing it today, right? Like it's sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns.
Yeah.
But it's very hard work, but there is another side to it. And so it's pushing through that and keep going, because you know the other side is going to take advantage of all of the magic that your brain has, because there's magic in there. And people tell us for so long it's bad, but it's actually not. It's just they haven't seen the brilliance yet. And it's about pulling it out.
And it's about setting yourself up in such a way that you have the space for that to shine.
Yeah. I love that. As we start to close down, I have 2 last questions for you. One is, what is one thing you wish women knew about ADHD?
Women who have it or women who don't have it?
Either or both.
Let's say women who have it, it would be, you're not broken.
Say that one more time for the people in the back.
You're not broken. You're just different. And for women who don't have it, it would be, I promise we still want to be friends with you. We just forget you exist sometimes.
Oh my God. I just feel like you pointed at me. Yes. Yes. I love that. Ooh, that was such a good answer. I got all the goosebumps and everything, Rebecca. And then if you could give one tip for managing your ADHD, not meds or whatever, but just one tip for someone to feel centered or good.
Yeah. So I touched on this earlier. Accepting your brain, which feels like really high level, philosophical, whatever. What does that actually mean practically? Yeah. On a practical level, it means when you notice your ADHD symptoms happening, right? So let's say I am trying to type an email and then all of a sudden, how am I on Instagram? I didn't even know. And now I'm like researching the history of like ostriches. And you're like, what is happening? How did I even get here? It's looking at that whole rabbit hole that you fell down and being like, okay, let's write this email.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I just wasted all that time. What is wrong with me? Like, who cares about this crap? Like, there's this whole narrative, and that narrative is really, really harmful, and it just like villainizes ourselves. When it's like, you notice it happen, you're like, yeah, my brain, that happened. Let me get back to what I was doing. Yeah. And what happens when we lean into that toxic narrative is that we shut down. And so then our prefrontal cortex turns off. Like I'm not going to get all into the neuroscience, but like when we get into that negative feedback spiral, it makes our functioning even worse. And it makes our brains turn off. Like the part of our brain that has the dysfunction turns off completely when we start beating ourselves up.
Yeah.
So it's seeing like, all right, this happened. I lost my keys, or I'm running late, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, it happened. It happened.
How am I going to rebound?
Yeah. And then we figure it out from there. But we don't go into that narrative like I'm a garbage human, because that just turns your brain off and it's not helpful.
Yeah.
And we become internal instead of being able to like
see what's real.
See what's real.
We start to make fake narratives. When we came up with this episode, we titled it The Lazy Girl Narrative. And I'm now realizing directly, we never even used that language.
We didn't talk about it anymore.
Yeah, but I do think a lot of this is that, right? It's even just what you said, the negative self-talk, right? We're lazy, we're not enough. Why did we do this? We should be doing more. Like, I think that all comes into the conversation, even though we didn't use those words. I think that comes through a lot in what we've talked about. So I wanted to thank you for that. Last thing, where can people find you? How can they be part of your coaching programs? Like, can they do it if they're not in Washington, D.C.? Like, give them all the details.
Great. Yes. You can find me on Instagram at adhd.harmony.coach. And then you can find me, my website is www.consciousstrides.com. So I know those two things are totally different, but that's where I'm at online.
And I'll put all of those in our social posts and all that kind of stuff so people can find you as well.
Yeah. Yes. And for coaching, people can join from anywhere. I've got people in there. Most of the folks are from DC because I live in Washington, DC, but we've had people pop in from California. Like, I have somebody who was like thinking about joining and they're like in South Africa. Like, it's you're allowed to be anywhere, but we have, the meetings are in Eastern time.
Fair.
So that might impact people's like availability during those times, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the talk. I actually think it's going to help a lot of people. So super appreciative of it. And I hope you had a good time while you were on here.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff. And yeah, the lazy girl narrative, right? Like, every woman I know who has ADHD thinks that they're lazy. And literally every woman I work with is like, oh, I'm so lazy, blah, blah, blah. And so I guess I would leave with, you are working so hard, you forget all the things that you've done throughout the course of the day, but you accomplished a ton of stuff. And celebrate yourself, be kind to yourself, and you have so much to offer. You're not lazy. You are amazing. Yeah.
What a beautiful sentiment. Awesome. Thank you, listeners, viewers, whatever you want to be called. We'll see you on another episode. Don't go away. All right. Lazy girl narrative, ADHD, all of the wacky ways in which our brain works. That is what we just talked about with our guest, REBECCA TOLBERT. And I cannot imagine a world in which there are not people listening going, oh, that's me. I felt that. Now, I could be projecting because that whole time I was like, oh my gosh, I need to join her coaching program and I need to go sit with her for a couple hours. She was so fascinating. But the other thing I would say is, hopefully for the listener, it wasn't too chaotic because two ADHD ladies talking to each other, we kept going and we had all these places and ground to cover. And so a little bit of squirrel action in there, but I loved it. I was supposed to do some research to tell you whether or not or when we started studying brains and understanding how they work and what's normal and whatever. And the first thing that happened when I Googled, it said 3,500 years of brain science. So apparently by the 1st century AD, there were Alexandrian anatomists. I don't even know if I said anatomist right, but they could do like general physical descriptions of the brain, basic structures. But modern neuroscience really started around the late 1950s and 1960s. Although we also do know that there was, and I think this got mentioned with the Asperger's conversation, that there was some German experimentation and research that came into play during World War II and kind of the Nazi reign. And then one little fun extra fact is that there was a scientist by the name of Galen who really was the person that understood that the brain controlled cognition and willed action. And this idea that the brain worked to combined with our senses, right? So our 5 senses. So that's kind of cool. And then when we talk about the brains and mental health and really when that kind of happened, it's really been throughout history, right? Of that kind of understanding of the brain. But you've seen kind of in modern history more work done to understand how it actually impacts mental health and the details of mental health and neurobiology and neurodivergency is coming. And while we do know a lot about like how the brain cells develop and speak to each other and all of that, the brain is such a complicated organ. And so that research continues and we're continually learning more, like everything else in medical science. I constantly am going to the doctor and being like, we're going to diagnose you with this, but we don't know a lot about it. And I'm like, how do we still not know these things? But it just shows you how complicated, beautiful, and diverse the human body is. So I'm going to stop rambling on and keep this ADHD in check. We hope that you enjoyed the episode and you learned something. And if you did, really give us a message, a DM on social media, and tell us what you learned about your own brain or ADHD and how you related to this conversation. You can find us at Wait, Hold Up What on Instagram or Eliminate Girl Hate. Let's start a conversation. Let's get more people into the dialogue and let's support each other. I hope you all have a fabulous day and we will talk to you soon on Wait, Hold Up What, a podcast from the Women at Eliminate Girl Hate. Until next time.